Chapter 37. Last week we wrapped up the life of Jacob, and next week the Wednesday night curriculum is going to be moving on to the life of David, kind of the second part of the life of David. But this week, all of the classes are sort of doing an overview. We're sort of reviewing the life of Joseph and Moses and Joshua this week. And so it's part of that curriculum where we all the classes on Wednesday nights are teaching the same things from the toddler class all the way up to us. And so we all kind of work on those same things together, and it gives us an opportunity to talk with those kids about what they learned, because we're all kind of learning the same thing. And so that's kind of a neat opportunity. And so tonight we're just going to kind of go back and look at some things that we looked at before, from Joseph and then Moses and in the life of Joshua. And next week we'll be picking up in the life of David. And so starting in Genesis 37, kind of reviewing the life of Joseph. And Joseph, of course, one of the main themes of Joseph's life are his dreams, or at least his dreams, and then other people's dreams, and his ability to understand those dreams and to interpret those dreams. And so when we first really get to know Joseph, he is just a boy of 17, and he is his father's favorite son, and his father gives him the coat that is kind of makes him the jealous, or all of his brothers sort of jealous of him. And he has these dreams. First one where he and his brothers are all binding sheaves, and then all of their sheaves bow down to his sheaf, and they all say, "What, are we going to bow down to you someday?" And then he has another dream where the sun and the moon and the stars all bow down, or there's 11 stars, and they bow down to him. And his father even rebukes him and says, "What, are your mother and I going to bow down to you someday?" But while his brothers are jealous, it does say that his father thinks about these things. He rebukes them, but then he's kind of contemplating, well, why would he have a dream like that? But of course we know his brothers are very jealous of him. And so one day his father sends him out to check on his brothers. They're out with the flocks, and he says, "Go and find them, and come back to me and tell me how they're doing, how the flocks are doing." And so they can see Joseph coming from far away, and so they make a plan. And at first, the plan is to kill Joseph, but then Reuben steps in and says, I can't let you do that. Let's just put him in the pit for a while. Reuben thinking that he'll come back and he'll pull Joseph out and take Joseph back home. But somehow, while Joseph is in the pit, Judah comes up with a new plan. He sees some of their distant cousins, the Ishmaelites, coming down the road, and he knows that they're on their way to Egypt to sell their goods. And so they pull Joseph out and they sell him into slavery to the Ishmaelites, and they make some money, and they rip up that coat and dip it in the blood of a goat, and take it back to their father. And their father puts all the pieces together and says, "Well, a wild animal has torn apart my son," and he's greatly bereaved by this. And for a long time, that's all that Jacob knows about Joseph. And so once we then get into Egypt, where Joseph is a slave, he's first purchased by one of the officers of Pharaoh called Potiphar. And Potiphar can tell there's something special about Joseph. And so he's everything that Joseph does, it's like King Midas's gold touch, everything that Joseph does, it just works out great. And so he trusts Joseph, and he puts Joseph in charge of all of his household, and Joseph runs his household for him. And it says Potiphar doesn't really even, go back and double check what he's doing. He just trusts that Joseph is doing a good job. But we also learn that Joseph was a very attractive young man, and that Potiphar's wife had taken note of him, and that every day he was in the house and she said, "Lie with me," and he always said no. But one day she kind of caught him, and she grabbed onto his cloak, and she was able to pull that away from him. And you notice that's kind of a theme in Joseph's story. Always has something to do with his clothing that kind of gets him into trouble. But she pulls that cloak away from him, and so he can kind of see how it looks like a compromising situation. And so he runs, and so she makes up this story about how he attacked her, and when she screamed, he ran away. Potiphar is outraged, it says, and so he takes Joseph and he puts him in prison. But even in prison, we learn God is still with him because he is a righteous person, because he is striving to do God's will. God is still with him, and so everything that Joseph does is blessed. And so the keeper of the prison puts Joseph kind of in charge. He gives him responsibilities. And while Joseph is in prison, after some time, he meets a couple of people who were also put in prison. Seems like there was some kind of attempt against Pharaoh's life, because you notice who it is that they put in prison. They put the chief of the bakers. Well, he's in charge of making Pharaoh's food. And so there's kind of an opportunity there where if he just got mad at Pharaoh one day, he might just slip some kind of poison in that food, And then he has the chief, they call it something along the lines of the chief butler. Basically, he was the cupbearer. Before Pharaoh drank anything, the chief butler drank a little bit of it for him to make sure that the chief butler didn't die. So we know that it's not poisoned. And I always thought, I really hope that if I were Pharaoh, I would hope the chief butler never got sick, because they're just like trading all those germs back and forth. But I guess they didn't know about germs back then. And so they can't decide right away who it is that attempted something against Pharaoh's life, so they put them both in prison, and they both have these dreams. And so Joseph interprets both of their dreams, and he tells the chief butler, he says, well, in the next 3 days, Pharaoh is going to raise your head up, which means in this case that you're going to be restored back to your position. And so he says, when you get there, remember me. I'm helping you out here, so help me out. I haven't done anything wrong to be in prison, and so bring my case before Pharaoh, and maybe I can get out of prison. And then the chief baker, he says, well, that sounds really great. So here's what my dream was. And Joseph says, okay, in the next 3 days, your head is going to be lifted up, but that means in this case that it will be taken off of your body, and you will, I don't know if the chief baker really did it or not. I'm not sure they had Clue board game, what they did back then to figure all those things out. But he took the fall for it, and sure enough, all of it turned out just exactly how Joseph had prophesied that it would. But the chief butler forgets about Joseph. For the next, I think it's 2 years, it says, he forgets about him until Pharaoh has a dream. And Pharaoh's dream has to do first with 7 cows, and they're healthy-looking cows. And then 7 sick cows come and eat those healthy 7 cows. And then same thing with heads of grain, 7 healthy ones replaced by 7 sickly-looking ones. And Pharaoh wants to know, this seems concerning to me. What is this dream about? None of his magicians, none of his wise men can solve this dream. And so finally, the chief butler remembers Daniel. I'm sorry. Similar kind of story, isn't it? Remembers Joseph and pulls him out of prison. And Joseph is able to say, God can tell you what this dream means. And that's even what he told the men in prison. He said, isn't God someone who can interpret dreams? And he's very careful to give God credit for that. And so he says, 7 years of good crops, everything is going to be great. 7 years of famine. If it were me, Pharaoh, I'd find someone you really trust. I'd put him in charge of the land. I'd store up grain for those 7 good years so that you have enough to eat for the 7 bad years. And Pharaoh says, I know just the man for the job. And so suddenly Joseph goes from very successfully doing his job in prison, but still in prison, to number 2 in all of Egypt. And that's later in the story, we'll see he's a Hebrew and they know it. The Egyptians won't even sit down at the same table as him, right? They think of it as an abomination, it says, to eat with a Hebrew. They won't even eat with him, but they respect him enough to put him in charge of everything. And kind of like Potiphar's, Pharaoh is not really even double checking what he's doing. He says, as far as our power goes, the throne is mine, but you're in charge. And so Joseph has this rise to power. He's given a wife. He has 2 sons, and Ephraim and Manasseh. And those sons, when he names them, it's sort of the idea that he can see how God is working all of these things out for good. And so he saves that up for the next 7 years. Then the 7 years of famine come, and Joseph has his first meeting after a long time with his brothers. the famine was not just in Egypt, but also in Canaan. And so they're beginning to run out of food. So Jacob sends those 10 of the brothers down to Egypt, and they are seeking out that food. And so he recognizes them, it says. He accuses them of being spies. Like, no, we're honest men. We have a father. We have a younger brother who's not with us. But he says, I'm convinced that you're spies. And so he throws them in prison for 3 days. And then at the end of those 3 days, he says, all right, 9 of you go back and return with your younger brother. I want to see the proof that you have a younger brother. And then Simeon, he kept in prison for all of that time. Well, they go home, and on the way there, they discover someone has put all their money back in their bag. It looks like they're thieves. They have what they came for, but they also have the money. And so they go home and they tell their father all these things, and he says, I will never let Benjamin, the youngest brother, I'll never let him go to Egypt. But time enough goes on, and remember, Joseph knows there's 7 years of famine. Jacob doesn't know how long the famine is going to last. The brothers don't know. They're assuming it could be over any time, but eventually they figure out they're out of food again. And so he says, go back, and Judah says, we won't go back without Benjamin, because he said, don't come back without Benjamin. So Jacob finally allows Benjamin to go back. And of course, Joseph sees Benjamin, and it says he was overwhelmed, right? He had to go find somewhere to weep because he was so overwhelmed to see his younger brother, who he hasn't seen in about 9 years at this point. And so they all have this kind of great reunion. That they don't know it's Joseph yet, but they have this feast together. And then he sends them on back home, all 11 of his brothers, but he's put their money back in the top of their bags. And he's taken, of course, his cup, and he puts it in Benjamin's bag. And he sends a servant to chase them down and accuse them of stealing this cup. And they're indignant. We did not steal the cup. Whoever stole the cup can be your slave forever. And so they go one by one. Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, all the way down to the youngest son. There it is in Benjamin's bag. So pack it all up and go back to Egypt. Figure out what we're going to do about this. And Judah says, remember Judah had promised his father. He said, I will bring Benjamin home. And so he tells Joseph, he says, look, we'll just all 11 stay here and we'll all be your slaves. And Joseph says, don't be silly. I'm not that harsh of a person. I wouldn't keep all of you. I'll just keep the one who stole my cup. Well, that's the very one that they have to take home no matter what. Joseph knows exactly what he's doing. And so he's sort of testing to see, is Judah the same kind of person that he was when he sold me into slavery? He wants to know, is Benjamin safe with these people, or is he going to get ditched at some point because he's their father's favorite son? And so Judah steps up and he says, just keep me. It's going to kill my father if Benjamin doesn't go home. Just keep me and let Benjamin go home. And so Joseph knows that they've changed. And so he breaks down and he reveals who he is. They're all shocked. They don't know what to say. And they have this great reunion. He sends them home with wagons so they can bring all their children. They can bring Jacob back from the Canaan land to Egypt. And it says when Jacob heard it, his heart stopped because he didn't believe it. Just so overwhelmed with the idea that Joseph might be alive. But then he hears all the words. He sees the wagons. And he says, well, they didn't leave with wagons. Right? They can't afford just to buy wagons. So there must be some truth to this. And so he packs up all of his family, so 70 people, and they make the trip all the way back to Egypt. And he's able to be reunited with his son after about, I think it's 9 years that he's thought Joseph is dead. No, it's longer than that, because that's just 9 years of famine plus some time before that. So it's been quite some time, but that he's able to be reunited with his son. And he goes before and he gets to meet Pharaoh. And it says that he blesses Pharaoh. And you remember, the one who does the blessing is considered the greater. That Pharaoh recognizes Jacob has a greater status than even he does. And so Jacob blesses Pharaoh and lives out the rest of his time in Egypt with his son Joseph. Blesses Joseph's sons above all of the other ones. And he dies. And then Joseph lives to see the fourth generation from his own, and then dies at a very age of, 110 years, I think, and makes them promise you'll take my bones back someday. You're going to be going back soon, and I want to go back with you. I'm not being alive, but I want to go back with you. And so that's really the story in a quick nutshell of Joseph's life. Any comments or anything important that I didn't pick up or didn't talk about, or anything that anyone wants to say about Joseph this evening?
I've always wondered why the Israelites didn't esteem Joseph like they did Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, because Joseph was the one that gave them the nation, put them in the place to make sure that they did survive and grew the nation there in Goshen. But I know that God didn't make the promise to Joseph.
Right.
He did to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But I've always wondered why it doesn't seem that they revere him as much as they do some of the others.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I suppose it's because he's just one of the 12, and it's Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. They each are just one of their generation, and he's one of 12. But you're right; they don't place him as high up as they seem to the other three. So yeah, he's very important in his generation.
If somebody told me, I guess I've heard it all this time, that was God's plan to get all those people over to Egypt.
Yes.
And, he just came over there. It didn't just happen that they had a famine and all that kind of stuff.
Right. No, absolutely. He even tells his brothers, he says, you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. And he orchestrated all of this in his own way so that I could be here and I could be in a position to save all of this grain. And he tells Judah, he says, it's so that our family, first and foremost, so our family can survive. And you think Judah, of course, is going to lead to the Christ. And so God is preserving all of that to get to Jesus someday by saving them from that famine. This is how he chose to do it through Joseph and to get those people to Egypt. Yeah.
That's one of the amazing things about God, how they meant it for evil. They were doing some evil things there, but God made good out of it. He used it for good things.
That's right.
And I'm sure that's still going on even today. We don't see it, but it's there.
That's right. Yeah. Sometimes it's hindsight is 20/20. We look back and we can see how God was working, but in the moment, in the moment when you're sold into slavery in Egypt or accused of something and thrown into prison, it doesn't really seem in that moment like it's all working out, but he always does work it out for good, and that's what he's good at.
Another reason we don't always see it is because we don't live long enough to see it.
Yeah, sometimes that's true. Yeah.
Sometimes it's generations down before you realize what happened.
Yes, and you just trust, and that's in the book of Hebrews. We'll talk about how Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, they never really even received the promises. God told them they would be a great nation, they would possess the land, but they never saw that. But they trusted that God was going to work all that out, and that's why they stayed so faithful. And so sometimes when we can't see how he's working it out, we just have to trust that he is and just keep on moving forward. So, yes, sir.
Think about that story. It's amazing what God can do. Mm-hmm. But he picked out the right man.
Yes.
And, he was tempted. We put our own selves with Joseph. I could see most of us said, well, I'm shutting her down. I'm not, his life could have been so great there with Potiphar even, But I'm surprised that Potiphar didn't have him killed if he really believed. But, but he didn't. But I don't know for sure why he didn't. He had the power, but that's quite an insult.
Yeah.
Yes. Because everybody believed it. But it's amazing that he stuck with God.
Mm-hmm. That's probably not that woman's first rodeo, so he may not know where it was.
That's what I was probably knew his wife. But the situation was she made it public.
Yeah.
Potiphar could not afford to not let something public pass.
All I know is just what it says, and it says that Potiphar was angry. That's what it tells us, is that he was very upset about it, and so he threw him into prison.
One of the things I like about the story, and I don't know if I saw this on the movie in the Bible, whenever they sit down at the table, that he lined them up.
Yes.
And
know,
Oldest
they
to
were
youngest.
Oldest to youngest, and, you know, they were like, you know, what's going on?
Yes, yeah. How freaky they must have felt in that moment when because that is in the Bible, by the way. But Joseph, when he sits them at the table, he lines them up from oldest to youngest, and they don't know he knows them. And so just he's giving them the impression that he's able to know things that he doesn't have a right to know, and so it's they were very I think concerned about that. It's just a neat little detail there that's there. Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
You may have brought up, I can't remember, Reuben,
Uh-huh.
when they threw him in the pit, his intentions were to return.
Yes.
And then, when he did return, he was not there.
Right.
And Reuben tore his clothes.
Mm-hmm.
And it just makes you, I think we've probably all been there too, you intend to have that courage. He just didn't have the courage to stand up. He went right along with his brothers, intending to go back and make it right.
Yeah.
And sometimes the intention is just too late.
That's right. Yep. Yeah. Sometimes we have good intentions, but we don't follow through with them, or not quick enough, maybe.
Not quick enough.
Us as parents also need to look at that and do our best to treat our kids equal. Because I can understand why those brothers
Sure.
was jealous.
Yeah. Yeah.
That coat had a lot to do with it.
They went out there and bragged around to those others that, did they say anything about the coat? But they said this orange sheet, that makes some kind of deal about that, they bad antique and everything, and so they weren't trying to, well, I'm getting it all wrong, I guess, because you're looking at me.
No. It's making sense. Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Yeah. I can understand why they would feel jealous as well, and that, of course, they sinned in their jealousy, and that was a struggle. But their father kind of put that in front of them, a stumbling block for them to trip over. And
Favorites was way back generation.
yes,
One of them got in trouble over that.
they did. Yes, they did, and it caused lots of family problems.
But I noticed that you can see in families sometimes too. Those brothers resented him and they punished him for it. And it wasn't his fault.
Right.
His dad.
That's right.
And you see that now, if somebody shows some partiality, then they don't like that one. For that reason, and it's no fault of that.
That's right. Yeah. It was the dad that created the situation. They just didn't have the maturity to point their anger where it really belonged. That's right. Yeah.
It kind of reminds me of Jesus' brothers themselves.
Sure.
They didn't believe in who he was, and even the people of it that he grew up with in his town.
Yes.
And he said, he doesn't even have respect from his own people, from his own town.
Yeah. Joseph is very much a type of Jesus in that way. Yeah. Were you going to say something?
Oh, I was just saying that poor Jacob. I mean, he kept stumping his nose.
He does.
Turn around.
A lot. He really does. Yes.
One other little mild observation here is that we go back to Jacob. We see the deceit of Jacob. But we rarely ever really bring up the deceit of Joseph. But because he practiced deceit too.
He did. Yes.
And we see that a lot. And what to make of it, I'm not sure.
Yes, there really is even instances where God will instruct prophets to, have somebody punch you in the face and go to the king and tell them. But in all of those instances, and Joseph as well, the intention is to deceive until you've ascertained maybe, he's testing them, or to teach somebody something, and not to deceive forever, but to eventually reveal the truth. And that's the difference between what it seems like Joseph and the prophets sometimes do and what Jacob does. But, it's kind of hard to know sometimes exactly how to make of all of that. You're right. Yeah.
Well, my point being is that, when we're discussing that hypothetical, is it ever okay?
Right.
Well, obviously sometimes
As
it's
a
been okay.
teaching tool, or as,
If the intent of the end run was pure.
And if there was intention maybe to reveal it,
To fix it.
yeah, to
Keith, don't we do the same thing with people when we say that get them that, you give them enough rope and they'll hang themselves.
Yeah.
We know something that they have done, but we're gonna see if they can get it. Hey, we'll just keep on feeding it to you until it comes up and catches you, or everything is revealed to everyone else. That's the same principle, I think.
Yeah. The reason why, and yeah, that intention to reveal it all before it's said and done, I think are important things to consider. All right, moving on then to the book of Exodus. And we're not reviewing all of Moses' life, but just what we have covered in this class so far. And so that's basically from his birth up to their arrival at Mount Sinai is what we have covered in this class so far. And it tells us that, after Joseph's generation died, so Joseph and his 11 brothers die. After that generation, then there's a new Pharaoh who does not know Joseph. And that he turns out really to be a pretty wicked Pharaoh. He oppresses the people of Israel, it seems, because he's frightened by their size. He sees how big that they are getting, and he's concerned about them. And so he thinks if he just makes their life harder, then they won't grow as much. But the harder he presses on them, the more that God blesses them and the more that their numbers grow. And so he commands the midwives. He says, when you're delivering the babies, if it's a boy, get rid of that. And if it's a girl, then that's fine. But the midwives refuse to do that. And so then he just commands the people themselves. He says, if you have a son, you're to throw it into the river. And Moses' parents, Amram and Jochebed, when she gives birth to Moses, they refuse to put him in the river. First, they hide him for as long as they can. And then they take him and they put him in the river. And his sister is there sort of watching. And that's when Pharaoh's daughter finds Moses and takes pity on him. And then there's his sister. She shows up and, she says, hey, I can find someone to be a nurse for this baby for you. And I imagine that Pharaoh's daughter probably understood exactly what was going on. She even says, this must be one of those Hebrew babies. But she says, all right, go find me someone. And so she gives the baby back to Jochebed. And she even says, I will pay you to nurse this baby for me. And so now Jochebed has her baby back, and she's getting paid to nurse her own child. And so, God really works that. But in the end, she does have to give Moses back to Pharaoh's daughter once he's weaned. And she names him, Pharaoh's daughter names him Moses, because she found him in the reeds. And he's raised in the palace with Pharaoh's people. And so that goes on until he becomes old enough. And it seems that Moses really begins to realize that he is intended to be the leader of God's people. He knows he's a Hebrew. He's aware that he's not an Egyptian. And so he goes out one day and he sees one of the Egyptians oppressing the Israelites. And so he sort of takes it upon himself as kind of the judge to kill that Egyptian and bury him in the sand to save them. Then he goes out the next time and he sees two Hebrews fighting, and he tries to jump in and to mediate as a judge between them. Why are you beating on one another? And it says the one who was guilty, right, the one who was in the wrong, he turns to Moses and he says, are you going to kill me like you killed that Egyptian? Who made you judge? And so Moses is sort of aware that this is his place in life, but he's jumping the gun a little bit. He's getting to it earlier than maybe God intended. God has not maybe called him to that yet. And so he's afraid. Pharaoh finds out and wants to kill him, so he flees to Midian, where he meets these shepherdesses of Jethro. We're told later in the book of Exodus, he's a high priest of God. And they're trying to water their flocks, but these other shepherds keep driving them away from the well. So Moses stands up for them. He waters their flocks. And so he begins to live with Jethro and marries one of Jethro's daughters and has a couple of sons with her. Time goes on, about 40 years goes by where he's living in Midian, and he's walking by and he sees a bush that is burning but doesn't burn up. And I love what he says. It's like he's talking to himself. He says, I'm going to turn by here and go and examine this thing to see why the bush is not burned up. And he's got a thought process. And the bush speaks to him and he's terrified. He says he's covered his face because he's afraid to look at God. And God tells him to take off his sandals, and this is holy ground. And he says, I have a mission for you. You're going to go back to Egypt. You're going to deliver the people. I've heard their cry. I've heard their agony. I'm going to deliver them and save them from Pharaoh. You're going to go before Pharaoh, and you're going to bring all these plagues upon Egypt, and you're going to take them back to the Canaan land. And Moses has all these excuses why he's not going to be able to do that. And in the end, God agrees that his brother Aaron can be the spokesperson. Moses will tell him what to say. Aaron will say it. And Moses agrees to do this. And so he goes and he meets up with Aaron, and they talk to the people of Israel. And the people are excited. And they kind of seem to have this idea that it's just going to be like, the next day, God's going to take them out of Egypt. And so Moses goes before Pharaoh for the first time. And he says, all right, we want to go in the wilderness for 3 days. We're taking everybody with us, and we're going to worship our God. And just as God said, Pharaoh says no. And in fact, he's so upset about it that what he had them doing was he gave them straw, and they made bricks out of it. And so he says, I will not give you straw anymore. Now you have to find your own straw, but I'm not going to lower how many bricks you're supposed to make every day. You've got to make the same number of bricks every day. And so he kind of puts them in an impossible situation. And when they go to Pharaoh and complain and say, why? When he says, well, clearly you have too much time on your hands, right? He says, idle. You're too idle. You don't have enough to do because you want to go in the wilderness, right? So he just says, Moses is causing this, right? And all the people are like, why did you even come here? You said God was going to deliver us, and now you've made it harder. And we begin to see the very first signs of what is a very hard-hearted people, that they want God's blessings, but they don't want to have to suffer any for it. They want God's blessings, but they want God to make it easy on them. And if there's any hardship, they're ready to throw their hands up and say, let's go back to Egypt, where we ate the watermelon and had all the things. As if that was a good life to live in slavery to a Pharaoh who really treated them pretty poorly. And so every time that Moses goes before Pharaoh, he says the same things. And Pharaoh, sometimes, at first he's always like, who is this God? I don't care about you. Get out of here. But as the plagues get worse, he'll start to say, well, I've sinned and you can go, but not your children. I've sinned and you can go, but no livestock. I've sinned and you can go, but not too far away. But and every plague gets worse and worse until finally there's the plague of the firstborn, where they institute the Passover, and they paint their doorposts and above the door with the blood, and they go inside and they eat the lamb with their sandals on and their staffs in their hand, dressed, loins girded, ready to move as soon as God says. They eat it in haste, and the angel of death comes in and kills all of the firstborn in the land who do not have that blood over their doorpost. And the Egyptians mourn so greatly, and they are so upset that not just Pharaoh, but every Egyptian comes out and begs them, it says, to leave. And so they do. They get up and they get out of Egypt. And then we have that pillar of fire and cloud that appears to lead them on through there. And so God it says he doesn't take them through the land of the Philistines, because he's afraid that if they have battles right away, that they'll give up and they'll go back to Egypt. So instead he takes them a long way around. He takes them down to the Red Sea, and Pharaoh's army begins to chase them. And he takes them to a place where they feel trapped, and they start to panic. And they tell Moses, they said, were there not graves enough in Egypt that you brought us out here to be killed? Wouldn't it have been better if we had just been slaves in Egypt and died at a not good old age from hard labor? And Moses asks God what to do, and God says, what are you waiting for, right? Hold out your staff, and the Red Sea parts, and they're able to cross through this giant sort of lake, if you will, on dry land, it says. And that's the crazy thing to think about is, if you are able to move water from where it is to a different place, the ground is still wet where it was, but not here. God moves the water and in the same instant dries the land so that they're walking on dry land. And there's several kind of interesting, when they wander in the wilderness for 40 years, it says their sandals never wore out. They never had to replace or repair their sandals. And just some little things like that God did to make their journey more bearable. And so they cross through to the other side, and Pharaoh's army enters and then realizes too late. It says their chariot wheels fell off, and they're just like stuck trying to drag themselves through the mud. And they realize too late they're not going to get to the other side before waves come crashing down. And so here, God's people, they finally kind of get it, at least for a moment. They forget it really quickly, but they finally kind of get it, and they have this great celebration. They sing this song of victory because God has saved them from their oppressors and from their enemies. Now, right away, they forget it really quickly. They come to waters, and it says the waters are bitter. And so they complain, why did you bring us to a place that has no water? Wouldn't we have been better in Egypt? And so God tells Moses to throw a tree into the water, and the waters become not bitter, and they're able to drink it. And God says, this is a reminder. I am the God that heals. Right? He healed that water. He's the God that heals. He can heal. He says, if you will obey me, I will never bring the plagues of Egypt down on you. I will always heal you. But if you disobey, then eventually those plagues are going to come on you just like they came on Egypt. And they go a little bit farther, and they complain about being hungry. And so God says, all right. And so he brings the manna down every day. And on the sixth day, on Friday, they're supposed to gather up double the amount of manna, because the seventh day, Saturday, is supposed to be a day of rest. And so every day they're supposed to only gather so much manna. It was a certain amount per person in your household. And you're supposed to eat it all that day, boil it, bake it, cook it, whatever you're going to do, eat it all that day. Get rid of whatever you don't eat, because there'll be new manna the next day. And if you don't get rid of it, what happened to it the next morning? It was rotten, right? It had worms, it said. Overnight, worms would show up in it, and it would rot, and it would stink. And that first day, some of them didn't obey, and it says Moses was upset, because I told you, this is how it was going to be. But the exception was, when you gathered the double amount on Friday and stayed it overnight, it didn't stink, and it didn't have worms the next day. And this is, obviously, this is from God. It's manna coming down out of the sky like dew, right? This is from God. But even just that fact that every day of the week, if you keep any, it stinks, except for that one day he said not to, it doesn't stink, right? Food doesn't work like that. It doesn't change the way that it rots. This is from God. He's providing all of these things for them. And so he provides food and water. They have their first battle, and they have victory over them, right? This is the battle where Moses stands up and he holds his staff up. But if his arms get tired and he drops the staff down, then the other side starts winning. And so they go up, Aaron and Hur, and they put a nice rock for him to sit on, right? A nice, comfortable office rock to sit on, and with nice lumbar support on it. And then they hold his hands up for him so that they can win the battle. And God's showing them he is with them. And then Moses meets up with his father-in-law, and he has a habit every day when they're not on the move. He sets up his seat of judgment, and all the people come to him, and he spends all day long dealing with big problems and little problems. And so his father-in-law Jethro says, it's not a good thing that you're doing, and you need to set up judges of hundreds and fifties and tens, and let them deal with all the little things, and they'll bring the big things to you. And so Moses is able to have a better working government that way. And they finally arrive at Mount Sinai, and it says that the cloud descended upon the mountain, and the people were terrified of it. But God, and I hadn't noticed this, or I'd forgotten about it until I was rereading this today, that God speaks the 10 Commandments to them from the clouds. Had you all noticed that? That first he speaks it to all the people, then Moses gets the tablets later. So. All right.
Asked Moses to don't talk to us anymore.
Yeah,
can't handle it.
they don't like to hear God's voice, right? It terrified them. So yes, yes, that's right. We struggle with the same thing. Complaining is a strong temptation for most of us, and that's why Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians, remember the destroyer that came when they complained, and try to cut that complaining out of your life, because it really does matter to God if we complain or not.
We often forget that for generations and generations there in Egypt, they did not get to make choices for themselves. They were told everything to do. They were slaves.
Right.
And then all of a sudden, you're free. They weren't trained how to make choices for themselves, and God had to give them time to train
He
themselves.
was very patient with them. Yeah, he really was very patient with them. All right, I think we are about out of time, so we will wrap it up there. And next week we will begin the life, or part of the life of David.